Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Enigma stage and to our next session, which is called Doing Better in Data Science. And this session is really important for all of us in the AI community. Of course, it's being touched on in many of the different panels and discussions that we've had throughout today. But it's going to be great to get a dedicated session right now all about these topics. So this panel is going to reflect on responsible and trustworthy AI in research and innovation. If we're enabling a more safe, fair, just, and inclusive world, how do we do that via AI? It is recognized that bias may seep into AI systems in multiple ways, resulting in inequities and potential discrimination, and diversity and inclusion must be throughout the AI lifecycle, from design to development, deployment, and monitoring, of course. This, of course, includes opportunities to tackle issues from data representativeness to algorithmic fairness, from diversity in data science and AI teams to more fair, transparent, open, and equitable benefit and access to AI interventions across society, science, and of course, the economy. So lots to dig into in this session. I'm really excited, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anjali Mazumdar, who's the AI and Human Rights Theme Lead at the Alan Turing Institute and the Research Chair of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. She's brought together an exceptional panel, not just to discuss the challenges that, of course, all of these topics bring up, but really to try and identify collaborative actions. So I'm really excited to hear what they all have to say. Welcome, and over to you, Anjali. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this afternoon's session. As Gemma said, it's entitled Doing Data Science and AI Better, from Algorithmic Fairness to Diversity. That in there packs in a lot. And this session is really bringing together 4 amazing researchers and panelists who are straddling both academia and industry, often both, and engaging with the public sector. And our aim here is to really come together and reflect on responsible and trustworthy AI, and in particular, the role of diversity if we are to enable a more safe, fair, just, and inclusive world. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Danielle Belgrave is a Principal Research Manager at Microsoft Research Cambridge in the UK. She's also on the board of Women in Machine Learning, and a researcher in machine learning for healthcare, focusing on using machine learning for personalized treatment and management strategies in mental health. Maria de Arteaga is an assistant professor at the University of Texas in Austin, in the Department for Information Risk and Operation Management. She also has a joint appointment in the Machine Learning Laboratory. She is the chair of Diversity and Inclusion for FACT, one of our main conferences on fairness, accountability, and transparency, and is the chair of the steering committee of Machine Learning for Design workshop at NeurIPS. She's a researcher on algorithmic fairness and human AI collaboration. Hal Daume is a professor at the University of Maryland and a researcher at Microsoft Research. He has held several roles and titles, chairing committees in diversity and inclusion. He's a researcher in the fields of natural language processing and machine learning, whose work focuses on human-centered systems. And finally, Shakir Mohammed, who's a research scientist at DeepMind, a member of the Royal Society Diversity Committee, and a founder of the Deep Learning Indaba that is committed to strengthening machine learning in Africa. As a researcher, his work ranges between foundational machine learning and generative models to addressing the more ethical and socio-technical factors in AI. I know that all 5 of us are really excited to be sharing the stage and to be discussing some really important questions on enabling responsible AI, the role and lens of diversity, which, if we're honest, can sometimes pose some challenging and also uncomfortable discussions from both a technical and a cultural standpoint. So just to give you a sense of how we're going to run today's session, I'll set the stage providing a framing and pose a couple of questions to our panelists. They'll kick off with a few minutes each to provide their initial thoughts. We'll follow this up with a couple of questions, and we also encourage the audience to post questions And then we'll wrap things up with our final thoughts on this. The session's going to go fast, so let's try to get on with it. If you've been paying attention all day and in the course of this field, then you will know that we have witnessed leaps in the development and application of AI, which is not only informing areas in our understanding in science and medicine, justice, development, and climate, but also with an aim to improve access and services for the public good, for society and economies. It is pervasive in our daily lives. It's being used from everything from credit scoring decisions to judicial decisions, to healthcare risk predictions, to recruiting decisions. So with the advancement and deployment of such AI technologies, it's also triggered a wave of concern regarding the trustworthiness of these systems. Some of these concerns are around physical harm, taking away jobs, or even exterminating humans entirely. But the other concerns, which are perhaps most relevant, are the concerns around privacy and surveillance or mission creep, increased digital divide, as we've seen in contract tracing apps and vaccine passports, to the ones that I mentioned earlier as it relates to access to services and the risk of bias and discrimination. So no doubt people will have heard and been exposed to various controversies, including, for example, challenges with facial recognition technology struggling with darker skins, or algorithms triaging healthcare access that have prioritized healthier white patients over sicker Black patients. We've also witnessed differing views by our own experts in the field as to why we observe such differential outcomes, particularly regarding the former example of facial recognition. One of the resounding themes that seems to be at the heart of these differing views is the role of diversity. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn to our panelists to hear their views on why diversity. What role and significance does it play? So to kick things off, I'd like Danielle to start us off, and then followed by Shakir, Maria, and then Hal.
Okay, thank you, Anjali, for that introduction and for introducing this really important topic. So it's always hard to go first, and I'm really excited about this panel and thinking of the discussions that this would generate. So to kick off the discussion, I guess, I thought of giving 3 points of reflection on why diversity. And these are just ideas to start discussion going and just generating. But I think the first and most obvious is that representation matters, that with technology, data science, and AI, what we're doing is creating a narrative for the future. And it's really important that if we're creating this narrative, that the narrative is created by a representative group that's representative of society as well. Otherwise, if the people creating the narrative of the future of AI and technology aren't representative, then we'd end up with power imbalances where there are few or smaller groups making decisions and creating this narrative of the future for the many. So it's really important that the talent pool of people working in AI, data science, and technology is diverse, and this is really important. I think the second point is that diversity is not an appendix, and sometimes we can think of diversity as a bandage of fixing something that doesn't work. So very often you hear of diversity spoken of as, okay, we have this system, we have this framework, let's make it more diverse. But the approach is we should really be thinking from the beginning, how can we make the people around the table representative? We shouldn't be thinking, oh, we're not representative, how can we fix this? Because then we run into the same problem of creating power imbalances and thinking that we're doing people a favor by including them and by adding this appendix of diversity. So it's really important that we create those environments from the beginning that are inclusive and that are diverse. And the third thought, I think, is, which is related to the two, is sometimes it's very easy to be reactive. We can think of the events of last week with the shooting of the Asian woman, Black Lives Matter. It's very easy for us to point our fingers at things that are unjust. And of course, these are very unjust, and we outcry at these things as well. But I think when we think of diversity as well, we need to do a lot of soul searching and think to ourselves, where does this come from? What are the individual contributions that I can make to make sure that these injustices aren't in my workplace, aren't with the people around as well? And this is about trying to mitigate those injustices in these systems of imbalance. And we can think on a day-to-day basis, how do I create environments that are safe for people who are different from me? How am I inclusive in my workplace as well? So part of creating these systems is that we're not reactive, but we're proactive in creating spaces that are inclusive.
Great. Shakir.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today, and what an honor to be in conversation with this panel. When I think about this question about why diversity, often you will hear two kinds of arguments which are put forward. One of them is the moral case for diversity, and the second kind of common argument you will hear is around the business case for diversity. That diversity is something that is good, we must do it, or that diversity builds better teams, and that's why we need it. But for us as researchers, as scientists, as engineers, as technical designers, I think for us there is a third, maybe more fundamental way for us to think about diversity, and that is how we think about the scientific method. And that diversity is a consequence directly of taking seriously the scientific method. So the scientific method will say to us that we as scientists, as researchers, as people who are advancing knowledge, need to take seriously the role of skepticism in our own work, to recognize that our own knowledge is limited, that we are always building knowledge in collaboration and in conversation with a much larger set of people. And so if you take that role of skepticism seriously, then a consequence, or one consequence of that, will be that diversity must be then part of the scientific method. It must be part of what rigorous and scientific excellence means. And so then necessarily we will need to find those voices who aren't at the table. We need to be proactive, not reactive, as Danielle was just saying. We need to be very mindful about who is there and that the role and the position that we have is justly derived in some sense. So I would just leave that with everyone, just to think that for us as researchers, this is where our motivation for diversity really must come from. The diversity for us is part of building a more critical practice of machine learning, of AI, a more critical practice of science. And that is what I hope we will all do as an industry, as a set of academia, as governments together working, that what we are actually doing is creating this kind of critical technical practice of machine learning, of AI, and of science. And then this is where diversity fits in. So I'll hand back to you, Anjali.
Great. Been great to hear Danielle and Shakir's perspectives. And now going to move it to Maria.
Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here today. To this question, recently I was listening to a conversation on diversity and management research. And Luis Martins, who's a professor who researches the impact of diversity in organizations, at one point said, diversity is. And what he was referring to with this is the fact that the world is diverse. Diversity is not a thing that we can choose whether we want to have or not. And while I think that this seems like a very obvious and very simple thing, I think that it's extremely helpful in answering this question, because the answer to why diversity is because if we do not have diversity, what we have is exclusion. And so asking why diversity is the same thing as asking, well, why not exclusion? And at that point, the answer, I think, becomes more obvious. And so at its core, diversity is an issue of social justice, but I think it's important that we understand that the absence of diversity requires exclusion. Diversity is not, the lack of diversity is not an innocuous status quo. And so I think that in this regard, Martin's perspective and highlight of diversity is something that is not a thing that we choose to have or not. I think that it helps us to see what are all of the barriers and all of the structures that need to be in place for spaces to remain homogeneous. And so I think that why diversity is because diversity is.
Thank you, Maria. I'm looking forward to unpacking more of these issues and ideas and thoughts that are being put forward by our panelists as we go forward. But next, I'd like to call upon Hal to give his initial thoughts.
Yeah, so thanks, Anjali, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm really excited to be here also. So I guess I had two things I wanted to say on this topic. So one is more on the technical, one is more on the diversity side. So I think on the sort of machine learning / data science specific side, one role that machine learning tends to play is that of scaling, right? So we have some processes that exist and we're using machine learning technology as a way of scaling them out. And I think if you look at, generally speaking, who is doing this scaling, it tends to be the people in positions of power. And the people in positions of power tend to be a more homogeneous group than the world's population. And so I think a fundamental question when we're developing like machine learning technology is basically how do we use it in a way that gives power to sort of the people who represent the full spectrum of diversity in the world, rather than power to those who hold most of the power already. The second thing, which is a little bit related, is more with respect to the specific diversity and inclusion question. And I think there's a division that's useful in drawing, which is the division of sort of individual actions for inclusion versus structural change for inclusion. And I suspect we'll talk about both in this panel. I think they're both important. So the first is basically something that's at least Maria mentioned about, basically how do we make sure that the workplace represents the world and everyone can sort of bring their all to their job. And then the second is structural processes. So as an example, when we were running ICML last year, one of the big questions we struggled with was, what are sort of the unwritten policies in this conference that lead to the exclusion of some people? And in a virtual conference setting, this can include things like time zone, this can include information gaps and who knows when deadlines are and how the whole process works. And so we did a small amount of work. I mean, there's definitely more that could have been done to try to close some of these gaps, but I think it's important to distinguish between things that I can do as an individual and things that we need organizations to do to change the way that they operate.
Thank you, Hal. So I've really sort of enjoyed hearing these perspectives, which sort of come at it from, a range in terms of structural potential issues that may affect both our field in terms of as a workplace, as well as to what it means in society. And I'd like to get back to another sort of point or issue, drawing from Danielle's first point around representation, but taking maybe another framing to it or an addition to it, which is the concept of identity and language. And so that participation is also coming about in another way, is that in machine learning or in our field, you often need to be seen in the data to actually benefit potentially from the AI intervention. Now, the 5 of us are based at UK and US institutions, but recognizing the diversity of this panel, not just in gender, but also from the fact that we draw from experiences and cultures that have connections to a larger set of communities and countries such as Colombia, South Africa, Trinidad, India, Canada, and other parts of Europe. So I'd like to raise this issue around identity and language, how we label people and descriptions, both from the perspective as a field, as a workplace that has an impact on society. And I know that we've previously discussed the differences in terms of descriptions of for instance, BAME in the UK or BIPOC in the US, so around ethnicity, and these labels that it creates. We've seen that this is how people are identified in a census to workplace hiring monitoring forms. And so that data is collected and then impacts how services and policies are developed. So without going on, the question really is, what effect or role does identity and language play in the context of AI research, and in a field that is somewhat plagued with an imbalance of diversity? So I'm going to reverse the order and go to Hal first, who is in the field of looking at language to pick this up. And then I'll ask Maria, Shakir, and Danielle to follow with their thoughts. So Hal, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I guess to start off, I'll label myself, I'm a white man from the US. I think one part of at least those aspects of my identity is that they often don't get mentioned. They're sort of the defaults, and I think it can be useful to explicitly name the defaults rather than just leave them empty. I think the labeling question is really difficult, and I'm interested to hear what all the other panelists have to say. I think that it can be useful in building coalitions and tracking success. You know, what's the gender diversity of our conferences or our companies or our organizations? But you know, lots of people over time, I'm thinking, for instance, work by Boker and Starr have pointed out that once you start categorizing people, things inevitably slip through the cracks. So, you know, if you're measuring gender diversity as man, woman, you're missing non-binary people, and you're possibly missing some aspects of trans identity. Similarly, in the US, we tend to have a racial category of Asian, which often serves to erase the experiences of some Asian populations with respect to sort of the majority immigrant populations in the US, mostly from East Asia. And so I think all of these things make it challenging to figure out the right way to talk about identity issues. And I think the important thing to remember here is that, like, you know, okay, I'm a language person, so I'm going to say language has power, right? Like, once we start naming things, that can be both useful, but it can also come with attendant risks.
Thank you, Hal. Maria, I'd like you to pick this up and maybe even potentially, you know, the role that this plays in research when we look at sort of development and justice issues.
Yeah, when we think about it in the context of our research, and as you pointed out, one of the elements that has come up as very important when we're thinking about issues of algorithmic fairness, for instance, is fairness through awareness. And so the fact that we need to have this information in order to A, be able to assess how we're doing, but B, often if we want to have bias mitigation interventions in algorithms. And I think one of the challenges that we have right now as a field in this particular issue is the fact that identity, the elements of the identity that we're concerned with are social constructs that vary depending on the context. And often I think that what we're doing is we're drawing from the context in which we're doing the research. And so, for instance, a lot of these identity labels are informed by the US Census for those of us doing research in the US, but that carries a lot less significance when we carry it over to other contexts in which the constructs are entirely different. The construct of race, for instance, is different when you change the context. And I think one element that is particularly challenging here, and here I think I have more questions than answers, to be honest, but is the fact that often we're also building tools that span contexts. So as an example, on Twitter, I am inhabiting my identity in the US, but also my identity in Colombia. And because I'm part of kind of both Twitter worlds. And my identity in each, in elements like race and ethnicity, kind of the race ethnicity mix is entirely different in the two contexts. And so I think that understanding how we have fairness through awareness in our data, but in a way that is both context sensitive, but also spans context when there are tools that are just across, and we cannot just say, oh, this is the one context we're inhabiting right now. I think that's one of the big questions and challenges in this space at the moment.
Shakir, I'm looking to you to maybe reflect and pick things up from your perspective here.
I think both Hal and Maria have said something. So the very important, like the breadth of our identity really does inform so much of our thinking. It informs what we will question, how we even know to question certain things. And this is ultimately why we are always asking about questions of diversity and identity. I would say in South Africa, we actually don't talk about the concept of diversity. We actually talk about a more general concept of transformation. And transformation is a process of not only including diversity, which is one element, but it includes other elements of equality, freedom, democracy, many concepts which actually come together. And so I often myself don't like to use the word diversity. I myself also use the word transformation. And in that element of language, it's sort of embedded in me. It's natural for me to think about transformation. And I prefer transformation because unlike diversity is, which is a description of a state, transformation is an action. I need to transform the state into a new state from the current one. So I actually prefer the language of transformation to the language of diversity because it's this kind of element of action that's involved. And the element of action is why naming things is so important. When we name things of the glass ceiling for women in the workplace, or we name categories of groupings because we are dealing with data here in the UK, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, or we are labeling things, the gender pay gap, microaggressions, othering. When we name them, they give us a mechanism for action. They give us the ability to bias towards action. They give us the way to create transformation in some sense, both at the individual level and at the systematic level, but also to realize that the question of diversity and transformation is not only one of identity, right? It is about so many other things, and I think we can't get caught up. It's not about identity, and then you have a certain kind of politics that brings back a kind of identity politics, and that we're obsessed with identity politics. This is not what we are doing. What we're actually interested in when we are dealing with the work of transformation is these fundamental questions: democracy, equality, freedom, diversity, and actually there are many other elements to think about. So I think there is an element of language that's really fundamental that we do need to continue to do. And I would say there's a danger also at the same time. In South Africa, if I give you that example, again, from the colonial and the apartheid era, we have inherited ways of labeling, creating awareness, categorizing people that we still use today. For some reason, 25 years later, as a country, we have not given up on the categorization of people as Black, white, Indian, and colored in the South African case. And it affects everything that we do, and that kind of ability to give up on labels is also something we need to think about, because it constrains us, it cuts off alternative ways of thinking, alternative lives that we could live and create. I'll give a second example around queerness, for example. The language of queerness has evolved, particularly in the US in one way, here in the UK in a different way. And in South Africa, we're also struggling with this language of, well, what does it mean to be queer? When an African tradition would have given us a very different way of coming to think. And actually the historical process has erased a word, a language, an experience that could have been there. Now words need to be rediscovered, and often they can't be rediscovered, so they need to be recreated. So there's a lot of complexity. I'm just gonna end my ramble there and hand it to Danielle.
Yeah, and from this, I really don't know what to say. And I think Shakir sort of hit the nail on the head that this is a complex space. But I also want to reflect a little bit on something So what Shakir's mentioned has helped me to reflect on my own cultural context as well, where the question of diversity, this is something that I've never thought about until I moved to the UK, that suddenly diversity was a context. And I'm from a very multicultural place. So in Trinidad, we talk about the concept of equality and the concept of we're multicultural and everybody's equal. So in our national anthem, there's a line that says, every creed and race has an equal place. So you think very much in terms of equality. And I think sometimes maybe this is one of the dangers in language when we think of diversity, that it's very much about the other. So Hal was mentioning this idea where it's like you have a default and everything else is other. And I don't have answers, but I think this is something that we constantly need to think about and question ourselves about as well. And it's very important that we have these sorts of discussions on, both on the individual level and on thinking of structures as well. Are we creating structures of equality, or are we creating structures of diversity? Is that really what we want to do? But yeah, I think, there's some really interesting points that have been brought up. There's the problem, there's the question of context as well. But how do we celebrate this individuality as well when we think of diversity or equality or transformation? So how do we look at it as something positive as well?
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to kind of picking up actually on Shakir's framing of transformation. But I've noticed that we have a couple of questions from the audience, which I think might be great for us to pick up on. So I'm going to put a couple of them forward, and I invite the panelists to choose how they want to respond. So one of them is, when developing predictive AI models, how would the panelists recommend ensuring data sets are diverse, representative, and unbiased for the task at hand? And the other question I'd like to add to that is, if diversity is being proposed as a route to general scientific rigor, is humanity as a whole diverse enough to reach the truth? So two really big questions there, but put that out. Maybe I'll go to Maria first on this one, and then, so choose which one you want to, or both.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm gonna comment on the first one, on when we're developing predictive AI models, how do we ensure that our data set is diverse, representative, and unbiased? And I think there's a lot to unpack on this question. And in particular, when mentioning the words, saying, okay, how do we, for a task, how do we determine if a data set is diverse? And I think that one thing that I found very, very useful in thinking through this, and it's something that in the fact tutorial that we had recently, we discussed, and borrowing from a work on philosophy of science and concepts of diversity, that is work that has been done by Dan Steele, Sina Fazlpour, and their collaborators. And it's the fact that there's different concepts of diversity. And so there's not the answer of whether a data set is diverse, and even for a task at hand, whether the data set for this task is diverse, doesn't have a yes or no answer. And so there's different concepts of diversity, of whether we mean for it to be, there's representative diversity, there's notions of egalitarian diversity, there's notions of normative diversity. And in the context of predictive ML models, one fundamental question there is, why is it that we want a diverse data set? Because that is going to help us inform what is the concept of diversity that is relevant here. And so if I say, I want a diverse data set because I want to ensure that a predictive model that I'm training has good performance across groups, then a representative notion for diversity is not going to make sense if my objective function is optimizing for overall performance. Because there, if I have a population that is that is a minority in the reference population that I care about, and then I have an objective function that just says, well, optimize for overall performance. We don't really care about what happens to small groups. That is not a concept of diversity that is relevant for this task and for this role. And so if what I want is to have a classifier that has good performance across groups, then maybe there a notion of egalitarian diversity in which I want to say, well, I want to ensure that all groups have an equal representation grounded on the way that I've constructed my optimization objective, that could make sense. And then also for certain tasks in which I'm particularly worried about the fact that different groups may be harmed in specific ways because of the context in which the tool will be embedded, then a normic notion of diversity, and there what that means is that it's not a symmetric notion of, well, I just plug in a group and it doesn't matter who's who, basically. There, that may also be important. So I think that understanding why is it that we want the data set to be diverse is fundamental for us to then saying, okay, what does diversity look like? What is the concept of diversity here that is relevant? And I know that there's other parts to discussion, but maybe I'll stop here and let someone else take on either this question or the other one that you posed.
Hal, would you like to come in potentially?
Yeah, sure. So I really like what Maria said about this being contextual and really asking this question of like, why do you want this? Because I kind of doubt that in most cases, like what you want is actually like, oh, I want this quote unquote representative or quote unquote unbiased data set. Like what you want, I mean, again, I'm just parroting what Maria said, is something else, right? You want your system to, you know, I think the machine learning community generally has focused on this like notion of group parity. So I predefine some groups and I want the system to perform roughly equally well on all those groups. Now what those groups are is of course going to be like super contextually dependent, both on the locale and the task at hand. I think maybe the one thing I want to add to this is sort of, I guess, okay, actually two things. So one is sort of challenging this notion of parity a little bit, and the second is challenging the notion of groups a little bit. So I think that the way that we tend to approach these problems is we say, you know, we want performance to be equal across everyone. But by doing so, we're ignoring massive historical injustices. And we very may want systems that correct for prior maldistribution of resources in the world. And so I think it's not necessarily clear that parity is always the right answer. In a US context, we've seen legal notions of parity backfire where like equal opportunity law, which was originally arguably supposed to help disenfranchised populations, is now basically being flipped on its head as a way of kicking down affirmative action programs and other diversity programs. So I think there's sort of a risk going with the parity direction. And then the other thing is sort of this groups question. So in a language context, it can often be really hard to figure out like, what groups do I care about? Like language is used in so many different ways, even a single quote unquote language like English or Spanish or Portuguese is used so differently across the world. And it's often the case that it's often the case that I think what people end up very nervous about is sort of the unknown unknown. So like, what are the groups that I should be thinking about that I'm not thinking about? And one thing I saw, this was in this study we did a couple of years ago when we were interviewing teams who were working on fairness for AI, that I thought was a really interesting idea is when they interviewed candidates, they gave them, for instance, the results of like an image search output. And some of them would be normal, and some of them would be sort of these stereotype things where you search for CEO and you get a bunch of 50-year-old white men, and they ask the data science candidates, does anything, like, how do these results look to you? And then used sort of the candidate's ability to pick out on cases of like lack of diversity in output and things like that as a way of determining like how broad of a worldview is this person coming with, and like will they actually be helpful in building systems that work for like a broader swath of people. So I thought that was like an interesting concrete thing that some groups have been doing to try to address some of these problems at a even at a small level.
Danielle, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion. I do tend to agree of so I work in a particular context, which is healthcare, and when you think of healthcare and creating social policies, I do think that sort of looking for representation is super important, and very often this means building communities of trust. And I'll give you a very specific example. So I'm working in mental health, and a lot of so mental health is something that's very stigmatized in the Black community, for example. So in order to collect data on mental health in the Black community is something that's very difficult. And for me, this has to do with collecting experiences of communities that if you just take a random sample of the population, you're not going to get that. I remember I was on a panel last year, early last year, and there was someone who was actually looking at how do you collect data from underrepresented communities, so in the Black community and in the Indigenous community as well, in the Indigenous American community as well, which is hugely underrepresented in mental health data sets. And this really brought home to me that this is really important work of building trust, because the narratives around, if you have predictive models for healthcare or for mental health care, we can't have systems that exclude those narratives. And there is that work of building trust within those communities. That's a very particular example. And I think, as Maria says, sometimes it depends on the context, whether you want to collect this data. But I think especially in health, where there have been so many stories of the experiences, especially within the Black community, being ignored in the healthcare system. I think there is this work of getting data and building up data that is representative of groups whose narrative aren't particularly typically in the picture.
Thank you, Danielle. I think that also addresses one of the questions that someone else has posed around, what are strategies we could use to improve diversity in patient and public data use for training and testing algorithms in healthcare applications. And I think this point of trust and where it is coming out, and we're seeing that particularly right now with COVID and this the challenges in both misinformation, but also that with biobank data and all sorts of areas where we might be harnessing that data for good, for health, medical decision making, but these groups are not represented, Blacks, Asians, some of these unrepresented groups, and how do we really reach out and engage with them in a positive way, some of which are also potentially finding that they are also being harmed in other ways in other domain areas. So Shakir, it would be great to hear your perspective on this as well. So I'm gonna hand it over to you.
On this particular point, I thought I'd pick up on Danielle, maybe just to be a little bit difficult with you, Danielle. I feel like implicit in what you're saying is that somehow we are due the trust of the public. But what have we done to make us worthy of the trust of the public? And I think that is really the question that needs to come up in all of this. We need to prove ourselves worthy, and in some sense, we should not be assumed that we are worthy. I think systems, this is where the systematic comes in, must be put in place to hold us accountable, to make sure that we are worthy and that we reach for higher levels of worthiness, if that is the thing. So I'm sure Danielle is going to have something to say about this afterwards. Maybe I will just say a little bit from the question from Marco around the general scientific rigor question that you also raised earlier. I feel like there's a lot of things to unpack in there. In some sense, there's a kind of, so the specific question that was raised for everyone watching is, if diversity is being proposed as a route to general scientific rigor, is humanity as a whole diverse enough to reach the truth? And yeah, we can have a long discussion. Part of that is a very old view of science, that science goes like physics, and physics is science, and it seeks the truth of Newton's equations. Unfortunately, as we've discussed this whole panel, science does not work like this anyway. A very small part of now science is related to finding physical objective truths of the world, and even that is itself questionable. So much of science is turned towards the social world. And so the consequence of that then is to ask a question of truth. And if we are seeking truth, it makes an implication that AI or our research data science is universal in some sense. And this is a significant trap of thinking. This is the problem of diversity as well. Diversity is meant to help us get out of the trap of universalisms, so that we think that the AI that we develop in the UK is somehow going to magically work the same way in the US, is somehow going to magically work the same way in South Africa, is somehow going to magically work the same way in Trinidad. That doesn't work, right? So we need to get out of this trap of universalism. And we also just need to think there's a kind of respect that is due to all people. Humanity is diverse enough, full stop, because that is the state of diversity. So there are questions around ethical personhood and how we are relating to each other that is also embedded in this kind of question. And we need, diversity is also about recognizing this core question of how we relate to each other, and that we need to give each other far more respect as ethical persons in this world. In fact, we can't only think about each other. We need to think about animals in this world. We need to think about the earth and the ocean. And these are interconnected sets of oppressions, and maybe this is going beyond the question of diversity, right? So anyway, I'm just going to end there, and so maybe Danielle, you want to come back on the trustworthiness point.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, and yeah, I hands down I agree with you that I think also as a community of data scientists, people working in tech, people working in AI, we also have to build that trust as well, and it shouldn't be just a given. So I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Would Hal or Maria like to come in on any of these things that have been raised, and also this larger sort of question around humanity and the scientific rigor and truth? all loaded words. Not wanting to put people on the spot, but I'm going to ask
I'll say
Hal.
something really quickly, if that's okay. So I think the trust point that Danielle brought up is like super important. This came up there was a workshop at NeurIPS last year on Indigenous and AI that brought in a bunch of people from Indigenous communities, and I found it like eye-opening. I think it's mostly recorded, and I'd highly recommend people take a look at it. But trust was a major component there. This has also come up, for instance, in a lot of linguistics work where people want to study, for instance, the language of First Nations populations or Native populations or Indigenous populations. And one thing that really sort of resonated with me in that context was sort of this notion of like data colonialism. So I think in the context in which I sort of grew up as a scientist, there was this notion of like, oh, there's this Web 2.0 thing. Like anything that's out there is like fair game, right? And so we write, tons and tons of papers where we basically scrape lots of data, we try to put it together and do something. And the view that was put forth was this is a very colonial attitude, right? It's like there's this resource out there called data, and it's mine for the taking, and like I can profit off of it and do what, build my career and do whatever I want. And a bunch of the discussion in this workshop was sort of pushing back against this notion about sort of who has sovereignty over the data, both at a like individual level and perhaps at like a tribal level in the case of some Indigenous groups. So I certainly can't do a good job summarizing it in like 30 seconds, but I think these issues of sovereignty and trust and things like that are super important if we want to reach out to communities to build data sets in a way that hopefully helps them rather than helping us.
Maria, would you also like to just step in and reflect?
Yeah, no, I think that these are all really great points. And I think that the one that I would just want to mostly amplify and maybe add to a little bit is Shakir's point that there's no, especially in AI, when we're thinking about what we're developing, there's no this one truth that we're looking for. And one element there is the fact that the future is not deterministic. There's different futures that we can build at this point. And one element there is that depending on whose perspectives are included, what questions are we asking and what questions are we deeming important? What elements are we valuing is going to change fundamentally. And so I think that once we reframe that from thinking that there's one answer that is hidden somewhere and we're just all looking for it, to, especially in the context of AI, we're just building one of many different possible futures. I think that this allows us to see how including different perspectives and whose voices are centered and heard can really change the way that the future ends up looking like.
Thank you. So we've moved really quickly. I mean, the session is nearly over, and there's still a load of questions, as well as my own. So I'm let's try to wrap things up and might put in sort of a heavy question with a lighter question, if I might, which is, what's the risk in our field if diversity is not embraced, and why hasn't it quite potentially made the progress that it has? And what specific actions would you offer or suggest that people can take and organizations can take? So with that, let's see, Shakir, do you want to kick us off?
What a big question in 1 minute and 30 seconds for all four of us. I will say that if we don't take diversity seriously, then we risk reproducing the harms of the past, that hundreds of years, of centuries of oppression, of harm to people, of neglect of people in this world will just be produced. And as Maria says, we will create a future that looks just like the past, that will enrich certain. And in fact, we can have another wonderful panel one day around the colonization of the future, which is already happening. So in some sense, we have to really be robust to this kind of question. Specific actions for all of us in our organizations, we have significant amount of power with which to think about assessing the kind of processes we are working with, looking at our hiring practices, looking individually at what the state of collaborations are, how we amplify people's voices, being mindful of the language that we kind of use, and then escalating that in the kind of grassroots organization and the kind of pressure that they put onto other kind of spaces, because really transformation will only come through this kind of contestation. And so I would say that we amplify our voices together, create spaces of contestation, and that can be the mechanism for change.
Great. Hal, can you pick things up?
Yeah, so risk, exactly what Shakir said. And then specific actions, maybe I'll just offer something a little bit off the wall, which is when doing research in machine learning and AI, always like repeatedly ask yourself the question, is a technological solution the right solution here? I think we don't ask ourselves that enough. And I think that this has major impacts on diversity issues as well.
Danielle.
So yeah, I think the risk, exactly what Shakir said, that we don't go to this sort of default narrative and move away from this. You asked one question as well, you know, the why have we not made inroads? And I think it's precisely because we're very comfortable with a default narrative. We're very comfortable with one story. And very often the stories and voices of underrepresented groups have been invalidated precisely because they are not represented. So I think this sort of way forward is what Maria said, this point of making sure that voices are centered and heard. And I would give one tip. How can we do that on an individual level? How do we create authentic relationships with people who are different from us? How do we create space so that others can contribute? Being very proactive with these attitudes as well, so we make sure people are heard.
And Maria.
I'll add one risk, and is the element of legitimacy. This is not just about us in AI having power and choosing to do the right thing. It's also about the fact that there's a huge cost to legitimacy if we're not doing this right. And I think that the UK saw it very clearly when you had protests against algorithms after your exam admission algorithmic approach. And so I think that there's a big element of legitimacy of the technologies that we're building. And we're, again, in the US, we're also starting to see it in the context of a philosophy of moving fast and breaking things in the context of computer vision has led to a lot of legislation that says, no, you cannot use certain type of technologies. And so I think that recognizing that this is not only about, oh, we're in a good position and we're choosing to do the right thing because we're very good people, but it's a fundamental element of legitimacy of the elements that we're building and the technologies that we're creating for the future. And then in terms of one way forward, I think that starting on the assumption, and this is not a very good sales pitch, but again, this is not when you're trying to change things. I think that starting by realizing that a lack of diversity often stems from the fact that there's something you're doing wrong. And I don't mean as an individual, but in the context of an organization, for instance. And so I think that it's starting from that premise and then looking to identifying, for instance, what are barriers of access, and identifying concrete barriers of access, and then working to reduce those barriers, or working to create pathways through which individuals in your organization can actually have an impact on what you want them to impact. In the context of this panel is how do we create different futures in AI?
Thank you very much to all four of our panelists. There's a lot packed in there just in that end too. And so first off, thank you to everyone. Thank you to the audience for your questions. They have not been ignored. We will be taking that on board, and the five of us are going to be coming together to sort of reflect on these, and we'll be putting on our own sort of statement on our thoughts on this. And so with that, I also just want to add, I mean, touching on Maria's, I think, points here too of, you know, we talk about diversity and inclusion, and really, you know, not just pushing diversity without inclusion, because otherwise that also creates a tremendous challenge for what we're trying to address. And with that, I just wanted to raise that at Turing, and as part of our role, we have embarked on a equality, diversity, inclusion strategy. One of our priorities is really to look at our role, particularly in the space, or my agenda, in terms of research in three contexts: as an employer, as a research institute, and as a national body. And by that, what I'm looking forward to with these four panelists and from our wider engagement with the community, it's really how we can use our role as Turing, as the UK's national Center for Data Science and AI, to really bolster the actions and activities that can really start to make a difference and a cultural change in our field and our space, both in terms of research and as a career and workplace. So with that, again, thank you to everyone, and keep in touch and keep the answers coming. We'll take them on board.